G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. I'm of course Calflos, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Path of Champions here in Legends of Runeterra, but we are going to be doing a tier list today where I will be ranking all 66, or is it 67? I'm not really sure, but all 60 plus powers here in the Path of Champions on this tier list, as you can see. So this video has been requested by one of you for quite some time, and I thought, let's finally take a look at it, because, there's no better time than the approaching new year to actually do a tier list, and I figured this could be something cool as well. Alright, so I'm just going to quickly go over the categories and how I'm gonna rank these powers. So first of all, there are 5 categories that I'm gonna be ranking here. S for 2 them good, A for awesome, B for
nice,
C for not bad, and D if I really had to. So as usual, my 5 standard categories here, no E's or F's, because in my opinion, I think all these powers have their own, perks and whatnot. They just probably aren't too great compared to the others, but I don't think they deserve to be ranked that low. Alright, so like I said, there are 60 plus powers in the game, so I'm gonna quickly go over each and every one of them. I won't go too in-depth to each and every single power, because if I were to do that, I think we'll be here all day, and I believe it will be a very long video. So I will try to make this fast, try to streamline things a little bit, not too fast I hope, but I will try to simplify things, that way I don't take up too much of your time, and it's also easier for me to essentially edit in the video editor. So as always, before I get into it, tier lists are really subjective. This does not necessarily reflect the overall efficiency or the overall efficacy of this particular power. It's just my personal experience with the power in the Path of Champions, so take it all with a grain of salt. Alright, so without further ado, let's kick things off with the first power. By the way, these are all arranged by alphabetical order. That's why you can see it's a mishmash here of rarities. I did not have them arranged according to rarity. That's gonna take up some time. I just figured we arranged them in the alphabetical order, and that way we could rank them accordingly. Alright, so let's start with the Afterlife Forbidden here. When an ally dies for the first time summoning Haunted Tomb, it's a common power. Now personally, I don't really like this power. Its only benefit really is that if the ally dies for the first time, you get a Haunted Tomb which will revive that particular dead ally after 2 turns. In my opinion, it's not that great. There's probably better options out there. It is landmark synergy, however, with Talia and whatnot, but it's really niche, I would say, in my opinion. I don't really like this power, so I'm gonna put this in the D. Alright, second up, we have Alternative Power Source. Game starts summoning Hextech Observatory. It's an epic power. So primarily, I would say this is landmark synergy, right? Because the Hextech Observatory is a landmark, but it is also fairly useful because it will be able to refill your spell mana the first time you play a spell every round. That is what Hextech Observatory does. However, I don't think this is particularly good because essentially there are better options out there for lesser rarities and whatnot. The power that I'm talking about here, of course, which will probably do a much better job compared to the Alternative Power Source, is probably going to be the Sorcery power, which will refill your spell mana every round. But with all that being said, I think it's great, but I don't think it deserves to be in the awesome tier, and it's not too bad that I'm gonna put it down in a C or D either. I think what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna put it here in nice. Alright, moving on, we have the Battlefield Training here. Round start, grant the weakest ally +1/+1 and common. So this is a power where I seem to pick up quite often, quite simply because there isn't really an option to pick up something else. And this is probably one of the powers that, I just grab if there's really nothing else to do. Grant this weakest ally +1/+1 is really straightforward. In every round start, it's a grant. It's fairly decent. It operates something like an endurance, if you will, or a fury, but it's a guaranteed +1/+1 because endurance you need to take damage, and of course with the fury you need to kill an enemy first in order to get the buff. This is basically just a flat +1/+1 every round, and you don't need to take any damage or essentially, deal damage to have it occur or something. So it's fairly useful. Is it the greatest? I don't really think so. I am gonna put this in the C category here. Alright, next up we have the Black Market Discount. Round end, reduce the cost of your most expensive card in hand by 1. It's an epic power. So this one is a really interesting one, right? Cost reduction is always great in the Path of Champions. I've always been a huge advocate of cost reduction or mana, mana gaining, if you will. In other words, both of which are cost reductions essentially. But yeah, I have always been a huge advocate of that in the Path of Champions here. So anything that reduces cost is really great in my opinion. However, the problem with the Black Market Discount essentially is that it's gonna reduce the cost of your most expensive unit. So say for example that you have it could be great with Ornn, don't get me wrong, stuff that will actually come on at a really high mana, stuff like Ornn and Aatrox. But yeah, coming off of that again, if we have an Ornn for example, right, and we drop him to about I don't know, 4 mana or something, and but usually by then you should be able to play it, but assuming you want to drop his cost even further, right? So what's gonna happen is that you're not gonna be able to drop his cost from maybe 4 to 3 if there is a higher cost unit in your hand as well. So basically what the point I'm trying to make here is that it really is situational. It's not the most consistent type of cost reduction in my opinion. And with that in mind, I am gonna put this in the B category. It has its uses, but obviously it's not the greatest. Alright, next up we have Bouncing Blades. Round start, create a Fleeting Blades Edge in hand. It's a common power as well. So this one is a really bad one in my opinion. Well, you know, bad is really situational, I'd say. If you use this on a Jinx, it's really good because it's creating a fleeting discard card every round. You are going to be able to, you know, either play this card and get the 2 damage, or you can let it discard if you want to. It also has its uses in the Annie and the Jin, I believe, the adventures and whatnot, because usually these 2 champions, I think Misfortune as well, they will run a Luden's Tempest. So anything with a Luden's Tempest will actually benefit from this, because essentially that Blade's Edge will go up from 1 damage to 2, potentially more with the Annie and whatnot. But it's a really niche type of category in my opinion. If you're running this on a champion that isn't going to be running Luden's Tempest, that 1 damage isn't really going to make a difference in my opinion. Well, it could of course, you know, drag you out of some tough situations where you need to get rid of Spell Shield and whatnot. But usually I find myself not picking this up if I am running a different champion that isn't really taking advantage of the effect from the Blade's Edge here. So I find myself putting this in the D category. Alright, next up we have the Can't Stop, Won't Stop. Allied buffs except Barrier are permanent. It's an epic power. This is a really good power, guys. I will say this straight off the bat. This is a really good power because essentially you get to get permanent buffs for that particular game. This power works exceptionally well with the Lee Sin because as we all know, the Lee Sin will get a 8/8 after you cast 2 spells every round. So this is definitely a really good pickup for the Lee Sin if you ever encounter it. Even outside the Lee Sin, this could be really useful because I know there's a couple of, you know, champions that will take advantage of stat buffs and whatnot. Off the top of my head, most recently I believe is the LeBlanc I played. The Sharpen Resolve, you could actually benefit from that with the Can't Stop, Won't Stop here. That's probably the most recent comparison that I can think of at the moment, but I think there's a lot of champions out there that will definitely benefit from this. And with that in mind, I see myself putting this in the A category, the awesome category. Alright, next up we have the Chilling Prophecy. Game starts, summon a frozen troll, set its countdown to 5, another rare power here. So this power is probably one of my favorite landmark powers in my opinion. That's quite simply because first of all, you get a frozen troll on the turn 5. So waiting for turn 5, although it is fairly long, it's fairly worth it in my opinion because the frozen troll is a really huge power spike. As we all know, frozen troll has a stat of 8/8, so having it come on a turn 5 is a really good power spike in my opinion. I don't think it's probably that great because essentially, you know, if you have to wait until turn 5, it could be a little bit risky, especially if you are taking on the Aurelian Sol and whatnot. It is useful, don't get me wrong. I have used this before. I cannot remember which adventure, but I have used this in the ASOL before. It actually helped me a little bit, but overall, I don't really think it's, you know, S tier or anything. I think it's fairly okay. It's fairly decent, but not the worst. It's also landmark synergy, which means it will work really well with Talia. Actually, it will do extremely well with Talia because Talia will be able to advance the landmarks and whatnot, but because of that as well, it's also a really niche category. So I think in my opinion, I am gonna put this in the B tier. Alright, next up we have the Counterfeit Production. Ground start, create a fleeting 0-cost counterfeit copies in hand. It is a common power. So this is also another one that I am inclined to put down in the lower echelons here, either in C, not bad, or D if I really had to. Quite simply because, first of all, copying cards is great, don't get me wrong. But my gripe with this one mainly is that it's gonna take up a space in your hand, and if you have too many cards, you're probably not gonna be able to draw the card you want because it's just gonna destroy it at the start of each round. However, it could be fairly useful, don't get me wrong. I find myself using this more often on the Jinx deck because essentially, you know, you get to get an extra fleeting card which will discard automatically at the end of each round, so it's just going to be extra damage onto the Nexus. Now, in my opinion, if I really had to rank this, I'm probably going to put this in the D category. I think this would be, you know, higher up in the D category, but I'm not really going to arrange all of these because, again, there are 60-something, you know, powers that I need to arrange, so we're just gonna assume that it's on the top tier of the D here, on the lower end of the C. I'm just gonna randomly put it here, but anyway, this belongs in the D category in my opinion. It is fairly useful because you are able to copy the cards that you want, but at the same time it could be bad because if you copy too many cards into your deck, you might not be able to draw the cards you want, and even if you do draw the cards you want, this could potentially take up space and it will destroy, you know, any potential cards that you draw that, you know, might be more important. Alright, next up we have the Crush. LSF Overwhelm, it's another common power. So this one is a really good one in my opinion. Well, not really that good, I'm probably over-exaggerating, but it's not bad, and I think you already know where this is going. But anyway, let me just talk about it for a second here. So the Crush power is really decent in my opinion, mainly because if you have a board which has a high stat, it will actually take advantage of this. Off the top of my head, I think champions that will benefit from this is potentially people like the Garen. I think Darius as well. Darius, does he have Overwhelm? I can't remember. I think the entire deck is Overwhelm, right? I can't remember, but anyway, yeah, anything that has a high attack stat will benefit from the crush here. Now, there is one caveat though. You should be able to get the crush from the Troll King's Crown relic, which is of course in the Path of Champions as well. The problem with that, particular relic is that it is a rare relic slot, so you will have to sacrifice one relic to, give the champion the crush. But sometimes I find it's probably more useful because essentially you are gonna get a guaranteed, overwhelm on all units through the relic, of course, and all you need to focus on is to pick up a, potentially a good power and whatnot. So you don't have to be strong arm or essentially, indecisive when you get a option of a crush as well as another stronger power. So all in all, I think it could be decent, but definitely not, B or A tier here. I'm gonna put this in the C. If I had to put this, more accurately, I think this is probably gonna be on the upper tier of the C. But again, like I said, there's a lot of powers. I'm not gonna go ahead and arrange each and every single one of them. Just assume that this is on the upper tier of the C and the lower tier of the B. Alright, moving on, we have Disarmed. Enemies have -1, -0. It's another rare power. So this one is, in my opinion, not that great. Enemies -1, -0 is not bad, especially in the adventures where you're taking on weaker enemies, I would say. Stuff like the regular adventures I'd mainly be talking about here. It should be fairly useful because you are able to mitigate some damage that is going to be dealt by an enemy there. But this doesn't really perform too well when you take on the Aurelian Sol. It will, affect some of the weaker units, obviously, but most of the champions are going to be able to double up their stats and whatnot, so it's not really going to be that useful. Don't get me wrong, like I said, it is useful on possibly some of the earlier levels in, the easier adventures and whatnot, but, into the A-Sol it's not going to be too well. All in all though, I will give this a C category because it is fairly useful but not terrible. At the same time, I'm probably not going to pick this up if I have the choice. So yeah, that's why it's going to go here in the C category. Alright, next up we have Domination. Round Start Rally. It's a rare power. So this is probably one of my favorite powers in the game because Rally means you are able to attack every single turn. It benefits almost every single champion because, at the end of the day, your goal is to deal damage to the Nexus. So Rally could actually help you there because you are able to attack every turn. It will benefit aggressive champions, but it will also help out the not so aggressive ones. So there is really no way that you can go wrong with the rally power, and for that I believe it should be in the S tier. Once again, I will not be arranging this because there's a lot of things that we have to go through here. So let's just assume that this is probably going to be a little bit lower because there is going to be a couple of legendaries that will fit, higher up in the S tier here. Alright, next up we have the Dragon's Rage. It's a common power. When you summon an ally granted fury, it is a dragon. So this is also one of my favorite powers in the game, mainly because it will give every single unit in your deck the fury buff, and the fury buff, as we all know, will actually get a stat increase every time it kills a unit. So it is really good, especially with units that rely on killing stuff. Up at the top of my head, I think Kane will actually work well with this one. Tom Kench and I think Garen, as well as Darius, will actually benefit from this. Anything that's also beefy will definitely benefit from this because essentially you are going to want to kill units and get the stat buff. However, the problem that I find with this power is that it's not too important. There are probably better options out there. The only reason why you'd want to go for this essentially is if you need the stat increase. But with that being said, this is not a terrible power. I think this warrants being in the B tier. It is in the nice category. I have used this to some great effect with the Yasuo because, as we all know, Yasuo's second star power will be able to get a +1, +0 whenever he kills a unit. And on top of that, his level 2 will strike a unit. And if he's able to kill that unit, he will still benefit from this fury buff. So Yasuo could be really, really strong with this one. And for that fact alone, I am going to put this in the B tier. Alright, next up we have the Duelist. When you summon an ally, give a challenge this round. It's another common power in this one. In my opinion, this is not that great. First of all, the Challenger is useful. Don't get me wrong, Challenger is really, really useful because you are able to fashion out chances that are probably more favorable in to attack and whatnot. But the problem with this really is that there's a relic that already does the job. I believe it's called the Laurent Blade Rack. It's a rare relic which you are able to get Challenger onto all your particular allies. And for the same reason like the Overwhelm, like I mentioned earlier, I'd rather go with the Laurent Blade Rack. That way you are not pressured or essentially strong armed to pick up this power instead of a better power if you're offered both at the same time. So for that reason, I am gonna put this in the C tier as well. Alright, so moving on, we have our first legendary power, Duplicate. Copy the first card you play each turn. This is an insane power, guys. I don't really think I need to say too much about this, but I will talk a little bit about it. So Duplicate, as we all know, is really, really useful on a myriad of champions. In fact, almost all champions can benefit from the Duplicate. Mainly the ones that will be striking the Nexus several times will benefit greatly from this because you are able to maximize the value of it here. I believe I did a Teemo run and I think a LeBlanc run as well with the duplicate. It was insane, guys. The recent ones, I would say, off the top of my head that I can remember. But yeah, duplicate is just great in general in my opinion. This is the power that I highly recommend. If you see it, pick it up. It doesn't really matter what other powers are available. Pick up the duplicate. The duplicate is what you're gonna need in order to be able to get a successful run. That, in my opinion, is really, really good. Obviously, 2 cards for the price of 1. You can never go wrong. I'm gonna immediately throw this in the S tier. It will probably be higher up than the rally here, but again, like I said, there's a lot of things we need to cover. I'm not gonna be too bothered about arranging. Alright, next up we have yet another legendary power, the Endless Wealth. Get 200 additional gold after each combat encounter. So this is gonna be probably very controversial, right? Because in my opinion, I think this is not the best legendary power available. Don't get me wrong, the 200 additional gold is nice because essentially you are able to benefit from several builds with this. Mainly off the top of my head would be a Bounty Hunter build where you are able to put on a Bounty Hunter's Renown, which will give a +1/+1 for every 200 gold if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, you can take advantage of that, and if you slap on a Heart of Gold, 2 other Heart of Gold builds as well. This is a Bounty Hunter build I'm describing here, not the power, just to clear up any misconceptions. So Bounty Hunter's Renown and 2 Heart of Gold, you are able to benefit greatly from the Endless Wealth. But the problem is that outside of that, I don't really see any use of the 200 gold. You should be able to get, a lot of gold from the power nodes and whatnot, and usually based on the way that, I play Path of Champions, I don't find myself spending gold too much, unnecessarily on smaller nodes and whatnot. I tend to save up the gold for, shop nodes and smooth solos and whatnot, so I don't really find myself spending too much gold, and that's probably why I cannot take advantage of this power. But based on my experience, I am going to put this in the not bad category. I don't think it's terrible, but I don't think it's that useful, at least based on the way I play the Path of Champions. Alright, next up we have the Endurance. When an ally survives damage, granted +1/+1, yet another common power here in this tier list. So this is a power that I seem to find quite often. I'm not really sure why. This actually, pops up quite often for me whenever I'm doing my runs. This is not the greatest power in my opinion. It is fairly useful because you are going to be blocking quite frequently in the POC. You will get a +1/+1 from it, but the problem with this really is that, if you are in a matchup where the enemy has a higher attack stat, you can't really benefit from this too much. It will benefit, if you are at a health advantage, if you will, with this particular power. It could be useful with the Tahm-Kench, don't get me wrong. Mainly if you have the Tahm-Kench, you might want to go for a couple of these. It could be really, really good. But unfortunately, outside of that, I don't really think it's that useful. It is not bad though, so I think we're just gonna throw it in this category here. Definitely not in the D. Alright, next up, Enfeebling Strike. When you damage an enemy, reduce its power by the damage dealt. Yet another common power for this one. So this is also another one that I'm inclined to put in the C category right off the get-go. Quite simply because the effect isn't too great. Yes, it will reduce the power of the enemy upon, striking, but the thing with this is that it's not really gonna be too beneficial. You might be able to take advantage of this in the weaker adventures or whatnot, because essentially you should be able to drop some of the attack stat of the enemies, but once you get to the assault, it's a whole different game plan. A lot of units are gonna have a really high attack stat, so the Enfeebling Strike isn't really gonna do anything. It will reduce the power, of course, but it's not gonna be that great because, that's still gonna be at a really high attack stat, and you're gonna be down 1 unit. So in my opinion, it's not that great. I'm gonna put this immediately in the C category. It's not too bad. It has its uses, especially in earlier levels or against weaker enemies, of course, but, I don't think it's gonna be that great in overall. Alright, next up we have another epic power here. This is Evolution. Allies have +1/+1 for each keyword they have. I actually like this power because first of all, it is a +1/+1, and you will be able to get this buff consistently if you have a keyword on the champion. So it will benefit greatly on the Kaiser and I believe the Bard as well. This is a really good power for both of them. Even if it's not on the Kaiser or the Bard, it will be, a really, really good power. I have used this to some great effect in the Aatrox, if I'm not mistaken, which is fairly decent. So I think with that in mind, we're just going to immediately throw this in the awesome category. It is really, really good in my opinion. There is really no way you cannot pick this up. Alright, moving on, we have Explosive Entrance. When you summon an ally, deal 1 to the enemy Nexus. So this is also another good power in my opinion, because first of all, you are going to be summoning units consistently. This is chip damage, it's consistent chip damage, and you have something like a Gale Force on your champion, it could be really, really beneficial, because as we all know, Gale Force will recall your champion, and you get to summon it on again. Thus, you are able to consistently trigger the Explosive Entrance several times. It will be a really, really good option to chip down the Nexus, and for that fact alone, I am going to put this in the A category. Now, I know some of you might be thinking right here, if this is in the A category, why is the Bouncing Blades in the D? Well, let me just give you this particular contrast says here. The Bouncing Blades requires you to play 1 mana to use the spell. The Explosive Entrance costs you nothing. All you need to do is you just need to summon a unit and it will deal extra 1 damage. Yes, it will lose out on the Luden's Tempest buff because obviously it's not going to take advantage of that. It's not a skill, but it is better overall because it will work with any champion. With the Bouncing Blades, however, it will not only cost you 1 mana, it won't do too much damage. Essentially, you're just dealing 1 damage for every 1 mana. So in my opinion, it's not that great. That's why I rank this at D and the Explosive Entrance at A. Alright, next up we have the Flash Steal. Round start, draw 1 and give it fleeting. When you discard a card, create a copy of it into your deck. Another common power here. So I don't really like this power in general, you know, on most of the champions because first of all, yes, you get to draw 1, but you're filling up your hand. So again, like I mentioned earlier with one of the, I think the counterfeit copies if I'm not mistaken, filling up your hand is not great because you are able to destroy your cards if you have, you know, no more space to put extra cards into your hand. But what I do like about a fast steal is the fact that it draws 1. So that essentially means that, you know, it will draw a card, and if you are looking for a specific card that you did not get, it could be fairly useful to have this power. But again, like I said, it will fill up your hand, so you have to be really careful with this. Overall, in my opinion, I think this deserves to be in the C tier. It's not bad, but obviously it's not the greatest either. Alright, so next up we have the Pharaoh Census. Round start, create a fleeting Pharaoh Prescience, Prescience. I'm not really sure how you pronounce that, but it creates that particular card in hand. You also have it at an epic rarity here, which means it's gonna be kinda difficult to get. So this power is actually really useful in my opinion, because first of all, it's a 0 cost predict, and as we all know, predict will get the card that you need at the top of your deck. So it has its uses if you are looking to draw a specific card and you can't seem to find it. But again, you have to look out for this card because essentially it is gonna be creating, you know, every round in your hand. So it could be a little bit detrimental if you do not have enough space to get the cards that you need. This could be a little bit of a, you know, backfire situation, if you will. But I think all in all, it is fairly useful. It's mainly more useful now that we have Echo in the game. Echo will definitely benefit greatly from this because he needs to predict. So I think this is going to be a really decent card. However, I don't think it warrants the A category. I am just going to throw this in nice. It's okay, but you know, not the greatest. Alright, next up we have Fixer Upper. Round start, give your weakest ally +3/+3 this round. Another rare power. So this power is also not bad in my opinion because first of all, +3/+3 is a huge power spike, especially on the early rounds. That essentially means you should be able to block most units or attack, you know, without fear of dying on the early round specifically. It does fall off a little bit later on, however, but I think it's, you know, a reward in the early stages outweighs the ineffectiveness or the inefficacy later on. I think it's a really good power in my opinion, so I'm just gonna immediately throw this in the B category. It's not bad, but obviously you can do better. Alright, so next up we have Flexible Gameplan. Game start, draw 2, yet another common power. This one is immediately gonna go into the D tier for me, and the reason for that is quite simple. First of all, game start draws 2. It's not the most you know, useful type of power in my opinion. Yes, you get to draw 2, but you know, obviously it's gonna be based on RNGs. So sometimes you will get the cards you want, sometimes you won't get the cards you want. And the main problem, my problem with this really is that it's gonna fill up your hand. So essentially, if you don't get the cards you need, you're gonna be stuck with 7 cards on the get-go. And that means there's gonna be 3 slots remaining for cards that you can potentially have. And if you still don't get the cards that you want in those 3 slots, you're probably not gonna be able to play anything. So with that in mind, I feel like the Flexible Game Plan is gonna go down in a D tier. And by the way, I should also add that the powers that you get once you fail the first 2 battles, that means if you don't pass the first 2 battles of each adventure, you're gonna get 3 I want to say unique, but they're not really unique, but essentially you get 3 powers that aren't too great. So these 3 powers are in the list as well, and I will be ranking them. I will try not to be too harsh, but you know, it is what it is. Alright, moving on, we have the Gearing Up. Game start, summon 2 Armed Gearhead, yet another rare power here. So this one, in my opinion, is not that great. This power could be fairly useful as just a chump blocking unit in my opinion, but it can also be good, you know, especially since in the early attacking levels, there is not going to be too many units with, you know, higher than 1 health. So the Armed Gearhead could be useful in that regard because it has quick attack. However, it will fall off really easily if you are not able to play any creator cards. So if you're not able to play any creator cards, you're not going to be able to raise the attack stat. And because you can't really raise the attack stat, you're probably going to want to use this as a blocking unit anyway. So in my opinion, it's not really that great of power, outside of certain circumstances of course. And with that in mind, I think we're just going to throw this in the D tier. Alright, next up, it's Grit. Allies have attack, roll my power to match my health. Yet another rare power here. This is probably one of my favorite powers as well, because first of all, you can definitely take advantage of this. So if you have a grid, you are going to want to buff up your health stat or whatnot, because the grid will essentially raise that attack stat to match that health stat, right? So it will be beneficial just to focus on buffing up your health stat. So this is going to be beneficial because first of all, it's going to be a permanent growth. That means that attack stat is going to carry over throughout the entirety of the battle. In my opinion, that's really good. So definitely this is something that I like, and this is something that I will pick up as well if, you know, the option is given and there's no better powers out there. So I'm gonna immediately throw this in the B category. I like this power. Alright, next up we have Higher Education. When you draw a card, give allies +1/+0 this round, it's a common power. This power will actually be really good with Misfortune, because obviously Misfortune gets a +1/+0 to all units. That's a star power, by the way, every time we attack. So we have the Higher Education. We will be able to get an additional +1/+0 onto all the units whenever she attacks. But outside of that, it could also be fairly useful on many champions because they are going to be guaranteed a draw every round. So it will be beneficial to both block as well as attack, because sometimes it might be lacking a little bit in the power department, in the attack stat department, and you might need a little bit extra just to block and kill a certain unit. It will also be beneficial because you might need that extra attack stat in order to deal more damage. So again, this is a fairly decent power. However, I think there are probably better options out there, so I am going to put this in the C category, not bad. Alright, next up we have Hold It. Round start, stun the strongest enemy. It's a rare. This is also one of my favorite powers. I love this power because first of all, a stun is exceptional. If you're starting out with a Panther Champions and you are really overwhelmed by the amount of powers you have, a simple rule of thumb is to just always pick up the stun. I've always done this at the beginning when, you know, I first played Panther Champions. I've always, you know, just went with the stun because I wasn't really sure what's good and what's not good. So I just picked up this power and basically I just steamrolled everything. Stun is really great. Do not underestimate this, guys, because first of all, this will bypass any potential skill checks. As we all know, Spell Shield is possibly one of the most annoying things to face because first of all, you have to get rid of the Spell Shield first and then you're able to play the spell again to get the effect. So if you are running a, you know, stun heavy deck, stuff like the Leona or the Yasuo, you might be having some problems stunning some of the units. But if you are able to get a Hold It here, you are going to be able to bypass that Spell Shield check because this will be a direct stun to the unit. It's going to negate or essentially, you know, like I said, go through the Spell Shield and whatnot. So this is definitely something I recommend picking up. And even though you're not running a control deck, this could be really beneficial because you are going to want to stun some units if you are in a battle where it's not too favorable. So I highly recommend picking this up. Hold It is probably one of my favorite powers here, so I'm going to put this in the S tier. It's probably going to be, you know, below the duplicate as it should be, but I think it's going to be higher than the rally. Alright, moving on, we have Hold'em of Round Start, Frostbite the strongest enemy this round. It's another rare power here. So this essentially functions similarly to the Hold It, right? Because first of all, this is the Frostbite, the Hold It is the stun. However, I am not going to rank this similarly to the Hold It because there is some major differences or discrepancies between the two. So first of all, the most blaring one is that both of these cannot function together. Some of you might be thinking, some of you who are new of course, is that, okay, if we pick up both the stun as well as the frostbite, we're gonna stun the strongest enemy first and the frostbite will frostbite the next strongest enemy. That unfortunately is not the case. If you have two Hold Its, it will function like that, and if you have two frostbites, it will function like that, but unfortunately stuns and frostbites will not work together. So essentially, if you stun the strongest enemy with the Hold It, and having the Hold 'em off in your power arsenal as well, that's gonna frostbite that same enemy. So obviously both of these are not gonna work together. So that's the number one caveat here. Now number two really is that Frostbite is probably, in my opinion, weaker than the stun. It is really useful on the Ashe because the Ashe will require Frostbite to level up, but if you're using this outside of the Ashe, I don't think it's that useful, and the reason for that being is quite simply because, first of all, Frostbite does not immobilize a unit whenever you're attacking, unlike the stun. That's quite simply because, as we all know, Frostbite only drops the attack stat of that particular unit down to 0, so that unit is still available to block your unit. So sometimes it could be down to a little bit of mathematical advantage in order to get the victory. So Frostbite could be a little bit hindering in that sense because the AI essentially will still be able to block your unit, unlike the stun here. So I think with that fact alone, I am going to put this Frostbite thing in the B category. It is fairly useful, don't get me wrong, it is fairly nice, but I don't think it's that powerful as the stun, at least in my opinion. Alright, next up we have In My Sights. Give the weakest enemy vulnerable this round, yet another rare power here. So this one is also a little bit of a mixed bag. In my opinion, I think this one sometimes could be good, sometimes could be shit.
Sometimes may be good, sometimes may be shit.
Now, the reason for that is quite simply because, first of all, this is like a weaker version of the Challenger power. So, Vulnerable and Challenger really does the same thing. The only difference is that with Vulnerable, you're granting it to the enemy, and with Challenger, it's your units that's going to be able to, challenge a unit and whatnot. Both essentially renders the same effect. The problem is that this definitely does a worse job because it only gives to one unit in every round. Unlike the Challenger, which will be available to all your units, which essentially means you're going to be able to challenge every single one of the enemy's units. So in my opinion, I think this is arguably a worse power than the Challenger here. However, it could be useful if you do not have a Challenger on your unit. So I am inclined to give this the not bad category. It's probably going to be on the higher tier of the D and the lower end of the C. But like I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to arrange any of these because there's a lot that we need to go through. Alright, next up we have another legendary power here, Level Up. Game start, shuffle 10 level 2 champions into your deck, they cost 1 less. This is probably one of the more fun powers in the POC because essentially it's super random and you get a lot of different units. The problem with this really is that it interferes a little bit with your, game start droid champion with the Hero's Welcome in the level 20. That's because it will shuffle 10 champions into your game after game starts, and the Hero's Welcome only triggers after the game starts as well. So you can potentially draw a champion that you might not need, although the chances of you getting a bad champion is really slim because first of all, you are going to be shuffling 10 level 2 champions. There's probably going to be at least one which will definitely benefit you on the early turns, or at least in the middle turn. It's really rare that you get something that will only be beneficial in the late game. But anyway, I am inclined to put this in the A category because it's great, but in my opinion, you might want to go for something a little bit more consistent. I know this works really well with Evelyn because first of all, Evelyn will actually get a +2/+2 for every champion level up, and this is really interesting because essentially the game registers this as shuffling level 1 champions, and once the level 1 champions enter your deck, only then it's leveled up, and that's why it contributes to the stat buff on the Evelyn. This also applies to any other POC deck that requires a champion level up to get a buff or something. But yeah, this is really an interesting factor in my opinion, so it is really useful. But again, like I said, if you are going with a certain strategy here, this could potentially interfere with something that you might want to go for. So with that in mind, we are going to slot this in the A category. Alright, next up we have the Lie in Wait. Allies everywhere that cost 3 or less are lurkers and gain lurk. So with the introduction of Pike, this is obviously a really good choice, right? Because first of all, you're probably going to be picking up a lot of non-lurking units. So with this particular power, you might be able to benefit from that greatly with the Pike. However, this is also really beneficial on champion decks that, have a lot of cheap units. And the reason for that is quite simply because, first of all, every lurk is going to be a +1. So if you can trigger this consistently almost every round, you're going to be getting a +2. Now, if you couple this with a rally, this is probably one of the more crazier combos in the game because, first of all, you're going to be triggering lurk every single round. Most of the time, I should add, it's not guaranteed. But essentially, you are going to be triggering it quite frequently. And because of that consistent triggers, you are going to get a really high attack stat on most of the champions or the units. And you are going to be dealing a hell of a lot of damage. So I find myself putting this in the B category because it is fairly useful, but you definitely want to go with something a little bit more stronger if it's ever offered to you, of course. Alright, next up we have the Lil Buddies. Round start, summon a random 1-cost Poro and epic power. So this power is fairly decent, right? Because first of all, you are able to use the Poros as a blocking unit, so that means you are able to mitigate some damage. It will struggle against overwhelmed units, of course. However, most of the time you are going to be dealing with units that do not have overwhelm, so essentially this could be really useful as a blocking unit. With that being said, however, I am going to put this in the B category, quite simply because on the attacking front, it's not really that useful. 1/1 Poros aren't really going to do too much damage, and essentially it's just going to be killing off the Poros, freeing up your slots in order to bring on an extra unit. But in terms of efficacy of the powers, I see it as useful as a defensive power here, not really as a, attacking power in my opinion. So I'm going to put this in the B category. Alright, so next up we have the Manaflow. It's an epic power with the effect, game start, get an empty mana gem. So this is probably also one of my favorite powers in the mode because first of all, extra mana gems are really great. I always consider these two categories of powers, interchangeable. So cost reduction, as we all know, reduces the cost of a card. Mana gem actually gives you an extra mana gem, so in other words, it's, really the same thing. Take it this way. Let's take the LeBlanc for example, right? With the cost reduction, you're still going to be bringing her on the 2 mana, which is turn 1. With the mana gem, you're also going to be able to bring her on the turn 1 with 3 mana. So in my opinion, these two are really interchangeable categories. But coming back to the topic in hand with the Manaflow here, I think this is a really good power. Get an empty mana gem is always nice to have. I'm going to put this in the S tier, however. I know some of you might be thinking right now, what about Perfected Manaflow, which we will get to in a second. Perfected Manaflow is also in the S tier. I'm just going to tell you all ahead, but it's probably going to be higher up than Manaflow. But again, like I said, I'm not going to arrange this because there's a lot we need to go through. Alright, so in terms of memory game here, round start, create in hand a fleeting copy of the last non-fleeting card you played. It's a rare power. Now, I don't like this power. I'm not really sure if it's because, I don't play it too well or essentially I'm a bad player. But the thing is, I cannot seem to remember what was the last card I played. And because of that, I always get, potentially the worst possible fleeting cards at the start of every round. So I'm pretty sure, some of you out there will definitely have better experiences with this. But personally, I don't do this one too well. I'm not really sure why. But anyway, I can only speak on my experience. So I'm gonna put this in the D category. Alright, so next up, Nature's Revenge. When you gain the attack token, summon a sapling, another epic power. Now, in my opinion, this power is, more or less similar to the Poro power where we are able to get, an extra unit, obviously. But the problem with this really is that you are going to be only getting one, and because the sapling is a ephemeral unit, it's going to die at the end of every round, and also it only gets, one every attack token, so it's probably a worse version of the Lil Buddies power in my opinion. With that in mind, I'm just gonna slap this in the C category, quite simply because it's not terrible. It has its uses because it has a instant challenger, but I seem to find myself going for better powers whenever this is available. There tends to be a better option out there, at least from the way I look at things. Alright, so moving on, we have New Student. Game start, summon a Sparring Student, a common power. So this is probably one of the powers that I don't really like. The problem really is that, I don't really find it to be too reliable in the POC. Mainly because, yes, it will be summoning units, don't get me wrong, and you are going to be able to trigger the +1/+1 every round with a Sparring Student. But based on what I have used of this particular power, I seem to find myself sacrificing the Sparring Student quite often. So in my opinion, it's not that great because it seems to last for like 1 or 2 turns and then eventually it dies off anyway. So therefore, based on my experience with this power, I am inclined to put this in the D if I really had to. Alright, moving on, we have the Officer Backup. Game start, summon a Sting Officer, a rare power. Now this is probably one of my favorite summoning powers, mainly because first of all you get to summon an elusive, and as we all know, elusives are really good, given the fact that it will be guaranteed Nexus damage. So Sting Officer is not bad in that regard because mainly it's elusive. Yes, it is a 2/1 unit, but if you have a couple of other powers that will actually buff its stats, it should be fairly useful. And even its effect, which will plant a Flash Bomb Trap onto the enemy Nexus, is not bad as well because that's of course more damage onto the units. But all in all, I think we're gonna put this in the not bad, mainly because of the elusive, and I seem to like it, so we're gonna throw this guy here. Alright, next up we have the Out the Gates. Game start, summon a random 2-cost unit from your deck, an epic power. So this is another one of the summon powers that I really like. First of all, because this takes a unit from your deck. So that means you don't have to worry about synergy or anything in whatsoever here. It will be really beneficial. And the fact that it will be taking a 2-cost unit from your deck, that means you can potentially drop, some champions down to 2 costs and it will summon that particular champion from the turn 1. That is definitely a probability, which is definitely really nice. One thing that you really have to look out for, however, is the consistency. Since this summons a random unit, that means you have no control over what's being summoned. With that in mind, what you have to do really is to increase the odds of summoning that card, and you can achieve that of course by giving that particular unit a lot of items. So that's definitely how you're going to want to take advantage of this particular power. And with that in mind, we are going to put this in the B nice category. It's definitely great, but definitely not awesome. Alright, moving on, we have Overprepared. Game start, create a random equipment in hand. It costs 2 less. So this power I frankly don't really like. Quite simply because, first of all, yes, it will create an equipment, which could be great. If you are lucky, you get a really good equipment, all the better. But because there's a myriad of equipments to choose from, sometimes you might get unlucky and you might not get the equipment that you want. Sometimes if you are lucky and you get the equipment you want, it's too expensive, you can't bring it on turn 1, even though it has the cost reduction. So with that in mind, the effectiveness of this particular power is not really good, at least from the way I look at it. Personally, I don't really like this as well because I don't really find the need to play equipments outside of equipment-specific decks. So stuff like the Ornn and the Kayn and the Aatrox will definitely benefit from this. And I know it will have some benefits on other decks, of course, but I don't really see the need to use it, or personally, I have not really seen it being too effective in the decks that I've played. So with that in mind, we are going to put this in the C category here. Not bad, but definitely not the greatest. Alright, next up we have Perfected Manaflow. Legendary power, round start, get a mana gem. So like I said earlier, Perfected Manaflow is gonna slot directly into that S tier here. And the reason for that is quite simply because it's obviously just a better version of Manaflow, right? Round start, get a mana gem. That is massive. I cannot tell you how good this particular power is because first of all, you're gonna be able to get I think 10 mana by the end of turn 4. If I got my mathematics correct, it should be around there. But basically, it's just a insane power. I cannot stress this enough. It works well with any deck because obviously mana is the core or essential thing to every single battle. So I don't think I really need to say much about this. This is a definite S tier for me. Alright, next up we have the Power Overwhelming. Round end, grant allies +1/+1, yet another legendary. So this is also another one of those good legendary powers, mainly because you get a consistent +1/+1 at the end of every round. Basically, it's a much better version of the endurance and whatnot because you don't need to take damage or anything. It's just gonna stack +1/+1 every single round to all allies on the board. So it's definitely something that is really good. Now, even though you are getting a permanent stat buff, this only goes on incrementally, slow increments I should say, where you get a +1/+1 at the end of every round. So potentially you will have to wait for quite some time in order to get your unit to a really high stat. For example, if we take a 1/1 unit for example, we have to wait until round 7 to get it up to an 8/8, which means it takes quite some time and it's not an instant power spike. And with that in mind, we are going to put this in the awesome category. I think it's a really good power. You should however not need to wait until turn 8 or turn 9. You should be able to take advantage of this right off the get-go. But I am going to put this here because I think it doesn't really crack the S tier. If I were to arrange this properly, I'd say this is on the lower S and the higher A's, followed by the level up and whatnot. But once again, like I've been mentioning, I will not arrange it because there's a lot to cover. Alright, next up we have the Quick Draw. Cards to draw cost 1 less this round, yet another common power here. So again, this is practically just cost reduction. This could be really great however, because if you have your champion deck at level 20, game start draw a champion with the Hero's Welcome can actually benefit from this, and this is how it's gonna work. So essentially every game start you get 4 cards, and that one card that's gonna be drawn, from that particular perk, if you will, the Hero's Welcome, that's gonna contribute towards the quick draw. So essentially that particular champion that you draw is gonna get his cost reduced, and because of that cost reduction, you can potentially bring it on the same turn that it was drawn if it's a really cheap champion. But if it's a really expensive champion, you're probably not gonna benefit from it. You just have to get lucky and hope that you draw the champion on the same turn where you are able to afford it. So it could be a little bit inconsistent, this quick draw, and for that fact alone, I am going to put this in the not bad category. It's okay, but again, not the greatest. Alright, so next up, Raiding Party. Common power, when you damage the enemy nexus, grant the top ally in your deck a +1/+1. So this could be a really decent power, and at the same time, it could be not that good. I realize that's a little bit of an oxymoron there, but essentially, I think you guys get what I'm trying to say. It's a little bit of a mixed bag in my opinion. Quite simply because, first of all, it's going to be granting the top ally in your deck +1/+1. As we all know, we cannot see what the top ally in your deck is, so sometimes it could be granting to a useless unit, or I don't want to be too harsh, but a not as great unit, I'd say, and essentially you're not going to be able to benefit from it too greatly, but most of the stats are already there. All in all, I think we are going to put this in the C, not bad. It's not the worst, but not the greatest. Okay, moving on, we have the Reset. Game start, create 3 Chrono Breaks in your deck. So it's a rare power here, and I think I really like this power, quite simply because first of all, Chrono Breaks is great, mainly because you get to revive all your dead allies. Even though they are ephemeral, you should be able to deal a heck of a lot of damage, and at the same time it will grant you a rally, which means you should be able to attack. But the best part about this power essentially is that with the Chrono Breaks, it does not necessarily need to have any dead allies. You can potentially play this even though if you have not had anyone die. You're still gonna get the rally and you can attack with what you've got. So I think this is definitely a great power in my book, and I am gonna put this in the B category under nice. I think this is decent, but obviously you can do better with the regular rally. Alright, moving on, we have Reunited. Allies are +1/+0, yet another rare power here. So this one I feel is in a similar situation or position with the Disarmed, because the +1/+0 isn't really gonna do too much. In my opinion at least, it could definitely benefit from this, maybe even a little bit more than the Disarmed. But I think overall, this warrants only a spot in the C tier. It's probably going to be higher than the Disarm, but again, I'm not going to rearrange any of these. So yeah, I think this could be fairly decent, especially in the weaker adventures or against weaker enemies. You might want that extra +1 onto most of your units, well not most, but all of your units, and it could definitely benefit you in some situations. Alright, next up we have the Rush Them Down. When you summon an ally, give it +1/+1 this round. It's a common power. So this is also one of my, well, I want to say favorite powers to pick up if there's really no other options, but at the same time, it's probably not the best either. And the reason for this is quite simply because it does give a +1/+1, yes, but it's only for that one turn. So that effect will obviously disappear after that particular round, but in my opinion, it is fairly useful. It has its uses, so I'm gonna put this in the C tier. It's not bad, but obviously not too good. Alright, next up we have the Seed of Power. Game start, summon an Empress die, a common power yet again. This will work really well if you can pair this up with the new student here. But assuming that you can, it will still function on its own fairly decently, because first of all, you are going to be attacking quite often, and because you are attacking quite often, it will trigger that Empress die effect where you will summon a attacking Sand Soldier. However, this power is a double-edged sword, and I am speaking from experience on this. Mainly because first of all, if you are facing a Fiora, that Fiora will take advantage of this and block that Ephemeral. It will contribute towards a level up, which will make things a little bit more tougher to win. And if you're taking on any deck with a lot of Furies, that is another nightmare in itself, because every single dragon will block this particular unit, the 1/1 Sand Soldier, get the Fury buff, and potentially kill you with the buff stats. So definitely something that you might want to consider before actually picking it up. And for that fact alone, I am gonna put this in the not bad category. Alright, next up we have Share the Bounty. When you target an ally with a single target spell, copy it on your weakest ally, epic powered. Anything that will be targeting your own allies will benefit greatly from this, because first of all, you are going to be copying it several times, and especially with the Varus, this is just an insane power for the Varus. So I don't think really much needs to be said about this one, because it is really good, because if you are going to be able to target your own allies, they're going to get double of that particular stat. If you have only one unit on your board, that specific unit is going to get both of the buffs from the Share the Bounty. Obviously, if you have multiple units on the board, it will function as intended, and that second buff will go to the weakest unit, but still, all in all, it's a really great power, and I think this warrants being in the A tier, the awesome tier. I think this is a really good one in my opinion. Alright, next up we have the Sharing is Caring. When you summon an ally, grant its keywords to allies, yet another epic power. I don't really think much needs to be said. This operates as how you'd expect it to operate. Bring on an ally, and if that ally has a keyword, any other unit on the board will also get the same keyword. This is a really good pairing, especially with the evolution, because obviously you're going to be able to grant every single ally the same keywords, and when every single ally has the same keywords, it's going to get a lot of buffs. So this is definitely a really good pairing together. I don't really think I need to talk too much about this one. I'm just going to instantly throw this in the A tier. I think you guys will agree with me with this. This is probably one of the more better powers in the Path of Champions, and I think this is a really fair assessment. Alright, next up, it's a rare power, Slow but Steady. When you cast this slow spell, cast it again on the same targets. So first of all, this is a really niche power in my opinion, because first of all, it only benefits slow spells, and there's probably not many slow spells in the POC, in the original deck I should add, not, you know, talking overall. Well, actually I could be wrong there could be a couple of slow spells that I might have forgotten or something, but off the top of my head at the point of this recording, most notably for me would probably be the Varus, because usually if I played a Varus, I would pair that up with a Hymn of Valor relic, which will create a redouble valor in your hand, and if you play this with the Slow but Steady, it will benefit greatly, because you are able to get double redouble valors, and if you couple that even more with the Share the Bounty, that's gonna be 4 redouble valor onto one particular Varus if you have only him on the board. I think that's a really insane combo here, but the chances of you creating that is kind of slim because you need to get both of these powers obviously, but in my opinion it is fairly decent. I don't think it's the greatest though, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put this in the B category. It's fairly useful, but I would say it's not that great. It's probably gonna be in the high Bs as well, because it is really flexible. It can work with any single slow spell. I'm just gonna leave it here because, like I've been saying all video, I'm not gonna rearrange these. It's gonna take a lot of time. Alright, moving on, we have Sorcery. Round start, refill your spell mana, a rare power. So this is one of my favorite powers in the POC, because obviously you get extra spell mana. However, there is already a relic which does the job, which is called an Archangel Staff. It's also a rare relic, which means it's gonna sacrifice one slot on your champion, but I think it's probably much more consistent than the Sorcery, because you need to get lucky and hope you get the Sorcery in your adventure. If you don't get the Sorcery, it could mean that you are gonna miss out on playing spells on a spell-based champion. And I think for that fact alone, I am gonna put this in the nice. It is fairly useful, but in my opinion, an Archangel Staff is a little bit more consistent compared to the Sorcery here. Alright, so next up we have yet another spell-based power, which is called the Spellburn. When you cast a spell, deal 1 to the enemy nexus. So I personally think this is a great power as well, quite simply because first of all, you are going to be dealing 1 to the enemy nexus every time you play a spell. It will benefit a lot of champions that rely on spells to function. People like the Lux, the LeBlanc, the Jinx also should work, Annie, and I believe the Jhin also will benefit from this if I'm not mistaken. But essentially, every single champion will benefit, because obviously there's going to be some number of spells in your deck. The only difference here really is the frequency of spells that you're going to play. And with that sentiment in mind, I am going to put this in the B category. That's quite simply because it is fairly useful, but I don't think it warrants being in the A. Mainly because it's really niche. You need to play spells in order to trigger damage, and if you don't play spells, you're not going to be able to benefit from this power. Alright, and the final spell-based power here is the Spellslinger. Your spells cost 1 less, another rare power. So this is also a really good power. Obviously, it's going to drop the cost of your spells in hand by 1, so it could be really useful on champions that are really spell heavy, like I mentioned earlier, like the Lux and whatnot. And this is also actually another reason why I say I recommend the Archangel Staff over the Sorcery. The reason for that is quite simply because if you are given a choice between the Sorcery and the Spellslinger, I would personally go for the Spellslinger. And the reason for that is quite simply because you cannot get a relic that will reduce the cost of spells in your hand by 1. However, you will be able to get a relic that will refill your spell mana like the Archangel Staff. That's why I ranked the Sorcery earlier at the B. But coming back to the Spellslinger here, I am gonna still rank this at a B. That's quite simply because it is cost reduction but only for your spells. Alright, so next up we have yet another rare power here, which is the Stabilize. When you summon a champion, summon an exact ephemeral copy of it. Yes, it creates an ephemeral copy, but the main reason why you'd want to go with the Stabilize is so that you can get the on-trigger effects of the champion and not really for the champion to survive into that specific round. If you can get it to survive, all the better of course, but mainly I want to Stabilize so that I could trigger my Gatebreaker instantly or potentially any on-trigger effects like I mentioned earlier. However, there is one little trick that you can use to take advantage of this, is that if you have a Gale Force on that specific champion that you have to Stabilize on, what's gonna happen is that before the round ends, you are gonna be able to recall that specific champion back into your hand, provided that champion hasn't died yet of course. And based on my experience with this particular power, I am gonna put this in the awesome category. I have used this to great effect with the Teemo and I believe with the LeBlanc as well. It also could be really beneficial in most of the champions, but unfortunately I haven't really tried it out too much. Alright, next up we have Stacked Against Them. It's an epic power. The first card you play each round costs 1 less for every 20 cards that start in your deck. So for every 20 cards that you have in your deck, you're gonna get a cost reduction on the first card you play every round. That means if you have 20 cards in your deck, you're gonna get a cost reduction of 1 for the first card you play that round. If you have a total of 40 cards in your deck, you're gonna get a cost reduction of 2 for the first card that you played that particular round, and so on and so forth. But usually it won't go that high. It's probably capped at around 40 or so. I don't think I've ever seen someone get triple cost reduction, but maybe there is and I'm not aware of that, so I'm open to know. But anyway, this is one of my favorite powers to have in the game because obviously it's cost reduction and a much better version of cost reduction as well, I should add. And for that fact alone, I am gonna put this in A for awesome. It's really great, really powerful. You are able to bring on really expensive cards on the turn 1 or potentially in the early turns, and you should be able to close out the game easily or quickly that way. Alright, moving on, we have Sticky Fingers. When allies attack nab 1, a common power. So I personally don't like this power because first of all, nab is, well, a little bit situational. Sometimes the nab could be good, sometimes the nab could be bad.
Sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe shit.
So my main gripe with this essentially is that because you are nabbing cards from the enemy's deck, you are filling up your hand a little bit more rapidly. And if you're unable to play those cards, you're not going to be able to draw cards that you need from your own deck. And as you may or may not know, Path of Champions is really heavily reliant on the cards that you get. So usually when you're building your deck, you want to build for things that will synergize well with the cards that you have. And having the nab here will basically obstruct that type of synergy. And not only that, it will fill up your hand faster. You're not going to be able to draw the cards you want because potentially your cards will get destroyed. And if they do get destroyed, you might not be able to execute your game plan or your win condition. And with that in mind, I think this is a really bad power. So I think I'm going to put this in the D category here. Alright, so next up we have the rare best defense power here. Allies have attack, grow my health to match my power. So this is basically just the reverse or the inverse or the converse, if you will, of the grid power where you get the opposite of the effect. Grid raises the attack stat, best defense raises the health stat. So this could be fairly beneficial as well on the blocking turn. If you have a unit with a high attack stat, attacking would grow that unit to a high health stat that will match the attack stat. But in my opinion, I don't really find too much usage of this because essentially you are going to be getting better powers in the rerolls and whatnot. And because you are encountering those powers, you're probably going to pick up those powers instead. And for that fact alone, I am going to put this in the not bad category. This is something that I will probably only pick up if there's really no other option available. Okay, moving on, we have the Craftsmans Favor. Round start, create a fleeting time and dedication in hand, a rare power. So this power is a little bit of a mixed bag for me. Mainly because, first of all, it's not really that important. And at the same time, it is important because it could be useful for decks that rely on equipment. The Varus, the Jax, I believe the Aatrox, and I believe the Kayn as well. Or you could also benefit from this, but usually Ornn will already have a passive time and dedication generator in the form of the Ornn's Forge, but it could still be useful. Anyway, this is not that great on most other decks. Yes, it will get a +1/+1 onto the unit that you're playing it on, but the thing is it's taking up space in your hand yet again. So it also costs 1 mana, which isn't too great. It's basically in a similar situation like the Bouncing Blades, but the only difference really is that the Bouncing Blades creates a spell that will deal damage to your Nexus. The Craftsmans Favor will create a spell that will buff your units. However, because I do recognize it is fairly useful on certain champions, primarily the Jax in my opinion, I am gonna put this in the not bad category. I will pick this up if I have to on other champions, but if there's a better option out there, I am definitely going for that and not this. Alright, next up we have Trifarian Might. When you summon a 5+ power ally, it strikes the weakest enemy. Now, I like this power because essentially it's a low effort strike. You don't really have to do anything. All you need to do is you just have to summon a unit and it will strike it for you. So this is one of my favorite powers because obviously it's a strike and you don't really have to do anything. All you need to do is just summon the unit and it's gonna strike for you. So obviously this is gonna be a really good pick for most of the decks because it's striking the weakest unit. It's gonna result in a kill most of the time, and you're essentially evening out the playing field if this happens. It could be fairly bad against battles like the Aurelian Sol, where there's probably gonna be a lot of beefy units, but it could be really useful, especially in the weaker battles and the weaker adventures. And for that fact alone, I am gonna put this in the A tier for awesome. I really like this power. Alright, next up we have Unstable Inventory. Game start, add a random item to each card in your deck for this game, legendary power. Because you are gonna be getting a random item for every single copy of the card for that particular game. So sometimes you can get something really good like a Titan's Axe, which will give a +3/+3, or a Ninja's Tabi, which will give an elusive on that particular unit. For that fact, I am going to put this in the S tier. So you cannot go wrong with Unstable Inventory, at least in my opinion. Alright, so moving on, we have the Unstable Manaflow. For the first 3 battles, game start, get a Mana Gem. So this is one of the powers that you get when you fail your first 2 battles of every adventure and you restart the adventure. You're going to get your pick of 3 powers that are not usually available. So this is one of them. The other one is actually the Flexible Gameplan, which is a really regular power that you can get in general as well. But this one and another one, which I will get to later, is specific to only that particular situation. In my opinion, this is definitely much better than the other one that I will describe later, but it's still far worse in comparison with all of the others. Obviously, you get a Mana Gem for game start, but the problem with this really is it only lasts for 3 turns, and after that, it's really going to be useless. There's really no benefit of this particular power, so for that fact alone, I am going to put this in the D if I really had to. It's going to be under the Flexible Gameplan in the draw too, but it's going to be higher than the other one later on. Alright, next up we have our final legendary power, which is the Unyielding Determination. The first time your Nexus would run out of health each game, heal it 30 and grant allies everywhere +1/+1. So this is probably one of the legendary powers that is fairly useful for, I would say, beginners who are potentially getting into the POC and are probably, just struggling a little bit with some of the tougher adventures. This could be something you might want to pick up. That's because essentially you get to continue that battle even if you've died and carrying on with whatever health the enemy has. You don't have to spend your revive, you don't have to redo the battle again, you can just continue. And also here's a little trick. If you use this particular power effectively, you are able to use this as a pseudo heal. Essentially what this means is that if you are down to 5 health for example, all you need to do is you need to make sure that the enemy attacks you, kills you, and trigger this power, and you should be back up to 30 health. All you have to do from there on out is kill the enemy in return, and you will still maintain that 30 health heading into the upcoming battles. And for that fact alone, I am going to put this in the A tier. I think it's really good. Alright, so next up we have the rare power called Vanguard Lookout, and its effect is the game start, summon 2 Vanguard Lookouts. So this is a fairly decent summon power as well. It's probably not the greatest, but it is fairly decent. And the reason for that is quite simply because this was probably originally intended as a blocking unit, so that way you summon 2 1/4 Vanguard Lookouts, and if it is intended as a blocking unit, it will definitely do its job well. 1/4 is definitely a really good stat line to use as a buffer, so in my opinion this is definitely a much better summon power in comparison with the Armed Gearhead power which we discussed earlier, and for that fact alone I am going to put this in the not bad category. I quite like this power in all honesty. Alright, moving on, we have Vitality. Increase your maximum health by 10, yet another rare power. So this is the other power that I was talking about earlier, which, basically is the sister power of the Unstable Manaflow, whereby you get this power if you failed the first 2 battles of each adventure. So essentially, this is not the best power in my opinion, mainly because it increases your maximum health by 10. It's only increasing the upper limit of your health. It's not healing your nexus, it's not really doing anything. All it's doing is just increasing your health from maybe 30 to 40 or 40 to 50, depending on what level you are attempting the adventure at. So in my opinion, I am gonna put this in the D category. It's not that useful, at least the way I look at it. And if I were to choose from the 3 specific powers that you get from every time you restart a failed adventure, which were of course the Flexible Gameplan Draw 2, Unstable Manaflow where you get a mana gem for the first 3 games, and the Vitality which increases your maximum health by 10, I would probably go with the Flexible Gameplan, because at the very least you get to draw 2 cards, and that could be a card that you might need to use to get the win, and essentially progress slightly deeper into the adventure. Now moving on to our final rare power of the day, it is going to be the Welcome Gifts. When you summon an ally granted a random keyword. This is a really good power because sometimes you can actually get really good keywords for this one. Kaiser takes advantage of this particular power beautifully. Bard also does fairly well with it, although Kaiser is probably a much better user of this particular power. If you combine this with the Sharing is Caring and the Evolution, if you're even lucky enough to get all 3 in one single run, you should be looking at a really fun run. Now I'm not going to talk too much about this because this functions as how it's intended. You get a random keyword, obviously, there's really not much to talk about. I think I'm going to rank this in the B category because sometimes you might not get the keywords that you want. Like for example, you might want a life steal to get back some health, but sometimes you might get a challenger instead, which really won't do anything at that point in time. Alright, next up is the final common relic of the day, which is the Wild Inspiration. Your created cards cost 1 less. This power is also fairly decent on its own. It's cost reduction, which is always great, but the problem with this really is that it's only cost reduction for created cards. Now ideally this is not really a bad thing per se, because you should be getting a couple of created cards here and there, but in terms of consistency, the usage of this power is kinda low, because obviously there's not too many cards that you're going to be creating usually in the Path of Champions. So with that fact in mind, I am going to put this in the not bad category. This could be really useful on champions like Annie or LeBlanc, where you are going to be creating fleeting copies of spells. That could definitely work well, and of course it could benefit Varus as well if you're going to be creating a redoubled valor and whatnot. There's a myriad of uses of this, but I am going to put this in the not bad because like I said, this is really going to affect created cards only, which is why I'm going to put this in the not bad category. It's not the greatest, but it definitely has its uses. Alright, for the final epic power as well as the final power of the day, it's gonna be the Yipp's Genius. When you summon a 1-cost unit granted a +2/+2. This is actually a fairly decent power because first of all, you are gonna have a lot of 1-cost units in your deck, and if you pick this up, you're gonna get a guaranteed +2/+2 stat buff on those specific units. If you pair this up with a Lil Buddies power, you're gonna be summoning a 3/3 Poro every single round. Unfortunately though, this only affects 1-cost units, which means it's not gonna be too useful outside of the first couple of rounds of each game, so that means I'm gonna put this in the B category under nice. It is fairly alright, but definitely not the best power in the game. Alright guys, and there you have it. That is my tier list of all 60+ powers here in the Path of Champions. Let me know if you agree with this list. I'm pretty sure all of you has their own personalized rankings and whatnot. I would love to hear them down in the comment section down below, and as usual, take everything with a grain of salt. This is just a reflection of my experience in the POC here. Yours may vary, and definitely feel free to leave it down below. Anyway, that is all I have for you today, so if you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like as well as subscribing. I really do appreciate that support, but most importantly, it's so that you don't miss future episodes or uploads of Legends of Runeterra or Path of Champions content just like this one. And with that being said, this is Kefla signing off. Thank you all so much for watching. Thanks for joining me as well. Hopefully I catch you guys in the next one. Goodbye.